There comes a point when silence stops protecting peace and starts inviting disrespect. Avoidant personalities often pull away from accountability, dodge emotional depth, and test boundaries through distance, cold behavior, or emotional inconsistency. The mistake most people make is begging for clarity, chasing validation, or reacting emotionally. But real power comes from calm words spoken with certainty. The right words don't force connection, they establish standards. And once those standards are felt, the dynamic changes completely. Respect begins the moment emotional desperation ends. In this script, you'll discover 6 powerful communication shifts that quietly command respect, protect your value, and stop avoidant behavior from controlling the relationship dynamic. The moment emotional chasing stops, the entire relationship dynamic begins to change. Avoidant personalities often become comfortable in situations where they can create distance without consequences. They may pull away emotionally, become inconsistent, disappear during serious conversations, or act cold whenever emotional closeness increases. Over time, many people respond to this behavior by trying harder. They send longer messages, ask for reassurance, over-explain their feelings, and constantly attempt to fix the emotional disconnect. But instead of creating closeness, this usually reinforces the imbalance. The more one person chases, the more emotional control shifts toward the person creating distance. That is why the words, "I don't chase what chooses distance," carry so much power. These words are calm, direct, and emotionally grounded. They do not come from anger or bitterness. They come from self-respect. They communicate that connection should be mutual and that emotional availability cannot be forced. This statement immediately changes the emotional energy because it removes desperation from the interaction. And once desperation disappears, respect often begins to appear. Avoidant personalities are used to emotional pursuit. Deep down, many expect that no matter how distant they become, someone will continue waiting, understanding, forgiving, and trying harder to reconnect. That pattern creates emotional comfort for them because it allows avoidance without accountability. But when someone calmly steps back instead of chasing, the emotional pattern breaks. Suddenly, the avoidant person is forced to feel the absence of control they once had over the situation. What makes this powerful is the emotional discipline behind it. Most people react emotionally when they feel ignored or disconnected. They panic internally and try to restore closeness immediately. But true confidence is being able to tolerate distance without abandoning your own dignity. It is understanding that someone's inability to communicate consistently is not an invitation for you to lose your emotional balance. Saying, "I don't chase what chooses distance," also creates clarity. It sends a message that relationships should not feel one-sided. Healthy connection requires effort from both sides. If someone constantly withdraws, avoids conversations, or leaves you confused about where you stand, it is not your responsibility to carry the entire emotional weight of the relationship. Real emotional maturity means recognizing when effort is no longer being reciprocated. There's also a quiet strength in emotional detachment. Not coldness, not revenge. Just the ability to remain calm when someone pulls away. That calmness becomes unforgettable because it is rare. Most people react with emotion, but emotionally strong individuals respond with boundaries. They understand that constantly chasing someone who enjoys distance slowly destroys self-worth over time. When you stop chasing, you stop proving that your value depends on someone else's attention. You begin protecting your peace instead of fighting for temporary validation. And ironically, that is often the moment respect increases. Because people naturally value what refuses to beg for acceptance. Emotional strength changes how others perceive you. It communicates that your presence is a privilege, not something endlessly available regardless of treatment. Respect becomes powerful when it is treated as a basic standard instead of a reward for good behavior. Many people enter emotionally difficult relationships believing that love requires endless patience, understanding, and sacrifice. Over time, they begin tolerating behavior that slowly damages their self-worth. Dismissive comments, emotional withdrawal, inconsistent communication, and cold behavior become normalized because they are afraid that speaking up will create distance. But the moment respect becomes optional in a relationship, emotional imbalance begins to grow. That is why saying, "respect is the minimum requirement," changes the entire dynamic. These words are simple, calm, and firm. They do not attack, blame, or create drama. Instead, they establish a non-negotiable standard. They communicate that connection cannot survive without basic emotional consideration. This sentence immediately shifts the energy because it removes the idea that someone can continuously cross boundaries while still maintaining unlimited access to your time, emotions, and presence. Avoidant personalities often struggle with emotional confrontation. When uncomfortable emotions appear, they may distance themselves, shut down communication, or minimize the concerns of others. Over time, this can create a situation where disrespect becomes subtle but consistent. It may not always look aggressive. Sometimes disrespect appears through emotional neglect, disappearing during important conversations, avoiding accountability, or treating someone's feelings like an inconvenience. These behaviors slowly create emotional exhaustion. The problem is that many people excuse these patterns because they focus more on preserving the connection than preserving their dignity. They tell themselves to be more patient, more understanding, or less emotional. But healthy relationships are not built on emotional self-abandonment. They are built on mutual care, consistency, and respect. When you calmly state that respect is the minimum requirement, you stop negotiating your worth. You stop accepting confusion as normal. You stop rewarding emotionally unhealthy behavior with unlimited tolerance. This creates psychological impact because strong boundaries force people to see you differently. The relationship dynamic no longer revolves around keeping the peace at any cost. Instead, it revolves around emotional responsibility. What makes this statement so powerful is the calmness behind it. People expect emotional reactions. They expect anger, begging, or emotional breakdowns. But calm standards are much more intimidating because they reveal emotional control. Someone who can quietly walk away from disrespect without creating chaos demonstrates real confidence. That kind of confidence naturally commands respect because it shows emotional independence. Respect is also deeply connected to self-perception. The way you allow others to treat you slowly becomes the way you subconsciously view yourself. If you repeatedly tolerate dismissive behavior, emotional inconsistency, or disrespectful communication, your self-worth begins to weaken over time. But when you enforce healthy boundaries, you reinforce your own value internally. You remind yourself that your emotions, time, and presence deserve care. Strong boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about controlling what you allow into your life. You cannot force someone to become emotionally mature, but you can decide what behavior you are willing to tolerate. And once people realize that disrespect immediately creates emotional distance instead of emotional chasing, they begin to understand that access to you is no longer guaranteed. That realization changes everything. Because people may ignore words for a while, but they always notice standards that are consistently enforced. One of the most emotionally draining experiences in any relationship is constantly feeling confused about where you stand. Mixed signals create emotional instability because they force someone to live in a cycle of hope and uncertainty. One day there is affection, attention, and emotional closeness, and the next day there is distance, silence, or emotional withdrawal. Over time, this inconsistency slowly creates anxiety because the relationship begins to feel unpredictable. Instead of feeling emotionally safe, a person starts overthinking every conversation, every delayed reply, and every change in behavior. That is why the words communication shouldn't feel like emotional guesswork carry such deep emotional power. This statement calmly exposes the unhealthy dynamic without sounding needy or emotional. It communicates emotional maturity because it prioritizes clarity instead of emotional chaos. Healthy communication should create understanding, not confusion. It should bring stability, not constant uncertainty. Avoidant personalities often struggle with emotional vulnerability. When conversations become emotionally serious, they may pull away, become vague, or avoid direct communication altogether. Sometimes this happens because emotional intimacy feels overwhelming to them. Other times, they simply do not know how to express difficult emotions openly. But regardless of the reason, unclear communication creates emotional exhaustion for the other person. The problem begins when someone starts adapting their entire emotional state around that inconsistency. They begin analyzing small details, searching for hidden meanings, and trying to predict emotional shifts before they happen. This creates a constant state of mental tension. Instead of enjoying the relationship naturally, they become emotionally hyper-aware, always trying to avoid disconnection or emotional distance. Saying, "Communication shouldn't feel like emotional guesswork," interrupts this unhealthy pattern immediately. It brings attention back to what relationships are supposed to provide: emotional clarity, honesty, and consistency. It sends a message that emotional confusion is not something to normalize or tolerate endlessly. What makes this statement powerful is its calmness. It does not accuse. It does not attack. It simply identifies the emotional reality of the situation. And sometimes calmly naming a problem is more powerful than reacting emotionally to it. When confusion is spoken out loud, it becomes harder to ignore. The dynamic suddenly shifts from emotional avoidance to emotional accountability. People respect individuals who can express boundaries clearly without losing emotional control. Emotional intelligence is not staying silent to keep the peace. It is having the confidence to address unhealthy patterns directly and calmly. Many people fear speaking up because they think it will create distance, but suppressing emotions often creates even more resentment and instability over time. Clear communication is also a reflection of self-respect. When you value yourself, you stop accepting relationships that leave you emotionally confused all the time. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. You stop believing that emotional unpredictability is a sign of depth or passion. Real connection does not require emotional decoding. It requires openness, effort, and honesty. Avoidant personalities may not always realize how much confusion their behavior creates. But when someone calmly refuses to participate in emotional ambiguity anymore, the relationship dynamic changes. Suddenly, emotional distance no longer controls the interaction. Clarity becomes the standard instead of confusion. And that standard matters because emotionally healthy people do not make you constantly question your value, your importance, or your place in their life. They communicate with consistency. They create emotional safety. They make connection feel peaceful instead of emotionally exhausting. Silence can feel incredibly powerful in relationships, especially when it is used during emotional tension or conflict. For many people, silence creates anxiety because it leaves room for uncertainty, fear, and overthinking. When communication suddenly disappears, the mind immediately begins searching for answers. Questions start repeating endlessly. Did something change? Was I too emotional? Should I reach out first? This emotional spiral is exactly why silence often becomes a form of control in unhealthy relationship dynamics. Avoidant personalities frequently use emotional withdrawal as a coping mechanism. When emotions become intense, uncomfortable, or vulnerable, they may disappear emotionally instead of communicating directly. Sometimes the silence is intentional, and other times it is simply their way of protecting themselves from emotional pressure. But regardless of the reason, repeated emotional withdrawal can slowly create a damaging power imbalance in the relationship. That is why the words "silence doesn't intimidate me" carry such quiet strength. This statement completely changes the emotional energy because it removes fear from the situation. It communicates emotional independence. It shows that someone else's distance no longer controls your emotional stability or self-worth. Most people react to silence emotionally. They panic internally and immediately try to reconnect. They send multiple messages, over-explain themselves, or desperately attempt to restore emotional closeness. But this reaction often reinforces the unhealthy pattern because it teaches the other person that silence creates emotional control. The more one person chases, the more power the silence seems to hold. But when someone remains calm instead of reacting emotionally, the dynamic changes immediately. Silence loses its ability to manipulate. Emotional distance no longer creates panic. Instead of feeling emotionally powerless, you begin observing the situation with clarity. This does not mean becoming cold or emotionally detached from everyone. It means refusing to let silence destroy your inner peace. There is a major difference between caring deeply and losing emotional control every time someone withdraws. Emotional strength is staying grounded even when communication becomes uncertain. The truth is, silence often reveals more than words ever could. It exposes emotional maturity, communication skills, accountability, and relationship capacity. Someone who constantly disappears instead of communicating openly reveals important information about their emotional availability. And once you understand that, you stop romanticizing the behavior. You stop treating emotional withdrawal as mystery or depth. Instead, you begin seeing it as a communication pattern that either improves or continues. People naturally respect those who can remain emotionally composed under pressure. Calmness is powerful because it cannot be controlled easily. When someone realizes their silence no longer creates desperation, anxiety, or emotional chasing, they begin to lose the emotional leverage they once had in the dynamic. This is why emotional independence matters so much. The moment your peace no longer depends on someone else's constant attention or reassurance, you become emotionally stronger. You stop measuring your value through responses, validation, or temporary closeness. Instead, you begin protecting your mental and emotional stability first. There is also dignity in silence when it is used correctly. Not every emotional distance requires immediate reaction. Sometimes the strongest response is observation. Sometimes the strongest response is allowing people to reveal who they are through their behavior. Constantly chasing answers often creates more confusion, while emotional patience creates clarity. When you truly believe that silence does not intimidate you, your energy changes completely. You stop fearing emotional distance because you know your peace can survive it. And that confidence becomes impossible to ignore because emotionally grounded people are rarely controlled by uncertainty. Consistency is one of the clearest indicators of emotional maturity in any relationship. Words can be convincing, promises can sound sincere, and temporary effort can create hope, but real intentions are always revealed through repeated behavior over time. Many people become emotionally attached to potential instead of reality. They focus on occasional affection, rare vulnerable moments, or temporary emotional closeness while ignoring the larger pattern of inconsistency surrounding them. This creates emotional confusion because they continue holding on to moments instead of recognizing the overall behavior. That is why the words "consistency reveals real intentions" carry so much emotional truth. This statement shifts attention away from temporary emotions and places focus on patterns. It calmly communicates that actions matter more than emotional highs, apologies, or promises. Anyone can behave differently for a short period of time, especially when they fear losing connection. But true emotional investment is shown through stability, reliability, and repeated effort. Avoidant personalities often create emotional inconsistency without fully realizing the damage it causes. One moment they may appear deeply connected, emotionally available, and attentive. Then suddenly they withdraw, become distant, or emotionally unavailable again. This creates a cycle that can become addictive because the emotional highs feel intense after periods of emotional distance. Many people begin chasing those temporary moments of closeness, believing the relationship is improving whenever affection returns. But inconsistency slowly damages emotional security. It creates uncertainty instead of peace. A healthy relationship should not leave someone constantly questioning where they stand. Emotional safety comes from knowing that communication, care, and respect are stable rather than unpredictable. When you say consistency reveals real intentions, you stop getting distracted by temporary emotional moments. You begin observing behavior with emotional clarity instead of emotional hope. This changes everything because emotionally mature people understand that repeated actions are more honest than occasional words. The power of this mindset is that it protects self-worth. Many people stay emotionally trapped in unhealthy dynamics because they keep waiting for someone's potential to become permanent reality. They ignore patterns because they are emotionally attached to rare moments of connection. But consistency forces truth to become visible. If someone repeatedly disappears, avoids accountability, breaks promises, or only gives effort when they fear losing access to you, their behavior is already communicating their level of emotional availability. This does not mean people cannot change. Real change is possible. But genuine change always appears through consistent behavior over time, not temporary emotional reactions. Someone who truly values connection will eventually create stability, communicate clearly, and show effort repeatedly without needing emotional pressure to do so. People who respect themselves pay close attention to patterns because patterns reveal priorities. Anyone can create emotional intensity for a moment. Anyone can say the right words during conflict or emotional distance. But consistency requires emotional discipline, maturity, and genuine care. It requires someone to show up emotionally even when things feel uncomfortable or difficult. There's also peace in accepting what consistency reveals. Instead of constantly searching for hidden meanings or making excuses for unhealthy behavior, you begin trusting observable reality. You stop forcing emotional fantasies onto inconsistent behavior. This creates emotional freedom because clarity removes confusion. When someone realizes that temporary affection no longer blinds you to inconsistent behavior, the relationship dynamic changes completely. They understand that emotional access is no longer guaranteed through occasional effort alone. And once that standard becomes clear, respect naturally increases because emotionally strong people value consistency more than empty promises. The moment someone becomes truly comfortable walking away from disrespect, their entire energy changes. There is a quiet confidence that appears when a person no longer fears losing connection more than losing self-respect. Most emotionally unhealthy relationship dynamics continue because one person keeps tolerating behavior that damages them internally. They stay silent to avoid conflict, ignore red flags to preserve closeness, and continuously give chances because they fear abandonment, loneliness, or emotional loss. Over time, this creates a dangerous imbalance where disrespect slowly becomes normalized. That is why the words "I'm comfortable walking away from disrespect" carry such deep emotional power. This statement is not aggressive, emotional, or threatening. It is calm certainty. It communicates that connection is valuable, but dignity is non-negotiable. It shows emotional maturity because it places self-respect above emotional dependency. Avoidant personalities often become comfortable in relationships where boundaries are weak. If emotional withdrawal, dismissive behavior, inconsistency, or disrespect never create consequences, the unhealthy pattern continues. Many people mistakenly believe endless patience will eventually earn emotional security. But without boundaries, patience often turns into self-neglect. Walking away from disrespect does not mean giving up at the first disagreement or becoming emotionally cold. Healthy relationships still require communication, understanding, and effort. But there is a major difference between working through problems and tolerating repeated behavior that destroys emotional peace. Emotional maturity means recognizing when a relationship is no longer healthy for your mental and emotional well being. What makes this statement so powerful is the emotional independence behind it. Most people fear losing someone they care about, even when the relationship hurts them. That fear creates emotional attachment to unhealthy dynamics. People begin accepting treatment they would never normally tolerate simply because they are emotionally invested. But once someone reaches a point where inner peace matters more than unstable connection, everything changes. People naturally respect those who respect themselves. When someone realizes you are fully capable of leaving unhealthy behavior behind instead of endlessly tolerating it, your value immediately rises in their eyes. Not because of manipulation, but because strong boundaries communicate self-worth. They show that your presence is not something permanently available regardless of treatment. There is also strength in understanding that walking away is sometimes an act of self-protection, not punishment. Many people stay in emotionally draining situations hoping things will eventually improve while ignoring how much damage the inconsistency is causing in the present. Over time, this emotional exhaustion affects confidence, self-esteem, mental clarity, and emotional stability. Being willing to walk away restores personal power. It reminds you that you always have a choice. You are not trapped by someone else's emotional availability or behavior. You are allowed to protect your peace even if it disappoints others. And once you fully understand that, emotional fear begins to lose control over you. The strongest people are not the ones who tolerate the most pain. They are the ones who know when enough is enough. They understand that love without respect eventually becomes emotional suffering. No amount of attraction, history, or emotional connection can replace the need for mutual care and dignity. When you become comfortable walking away from disrespect, your standards become visible without needing constant explanation. Your calmness speaks for you. Your boundaries speak for you. And people begin realizing that if they want access to your energy, your time, and your presence, respect is no longer optional.